When I'm working with farmers, particularly farmers that are interested in coming into organic, um, I always, tell them to start with a systems approach. Um, and sometimes tongue in cheek, I'll tell them that if uh, if I can't talk you out of it, you might be committed enough to make it work. And and of course, I say that as a joke, and I work with people to make sure that they're successful, at least as successful as they can be. But you need to come into this thing with your eyes wide open. And and I've got two slots or sayings here. Like conventional farming is like reactive farming. You treat problems as they occur. I mean, you're typically going to, let's say, you're going to grow corn and soybeans, which is very common in the upper Midwest. And if you got a nutrient problem, particularly nitrogen, you can just pick up the phone and you can solve that problem. If you've got a weed, you got an insect, you got a disease, um, you can pick up in most of those things. You're going to be able to solve through the use of materials that aren't necessarily available to organic producers. So, as a result, I mean, if you're looking at organic farming is like proactive farming. You have to anticipate potential problems before they occur. You need to design a system to minimize problems from occurring wherever possible. In other words, you need to incorporate resilience into these operations when it comes to nutrient cycling, um, to weed management, to insects, disease, and the whole bit, because you don't have those things to back up on. There are some things that we can use, but they're not always as effective as what you may have been used to as a conventional farmer. Next slide, please. So the areas we're going to talk about is nutrients, weeds, insects, disease, plant population. I think Mike talked on that a little bit. I found it interesting that he's talking about increasing his plant population because that's consistent with the way I've been working with farmers over the last number of years. Because is one person farmer, very successful organic farmer, mentioned to me once that you want to plant thick enough so that you're motivated to thin them out. And I thought that was a really good take on it. And then, view the overall environmental impact. Is your soil improving? What's happening with your weed pressure? What's happening with the insects and diseases? Are these problems, are they becoming more manageable, or are they getting out of control? Because if they're getting out of control, you have to change path. You have to start looking at, we may need to change the crop rotation, grow some alternative crops. We may have to start doing, producing hay and forages and things like that to bail us out of some of the problems that we have that we can't fix. We don't have a chemical solution for. Okay, to the next slide. Let's just skip this one. This is redundant. So we'll start with assessing your soil's fertility and nutrient needs. Mike did a really good job on touching on that. And so it's good to implement a soil testing, manure composting testing program, utilizing an appropriate testing lab by region, agency requirements. The reason I bring that up is oftentimes if you're working within the state, you're dealing with manure, you are, you're, maybe you've got an NRCS program, you're kind of restricted to using the appropriate labs that you can take those results and make the appropriate fertilizer recommendations, which are more local to the state that you're in. In other words, just an example, the University of Minnesota, their fertilizer recommendations are calibrated off a specific soil test. And so if you start mixing and matching, they're not as accurate. Let's see, where am I at? Okay, the middle point here, evaluate the nutrient flow on your farm from crop rotations, legume contributions, and manure compost applications and soil types. I mean, that's just the whole core and the art of nutrient management, keeping track of not only what's going to be coming available this year, but what was available, what's coming from last year and possibly the year before, and potential year for that, so that you can account to that to make sure that you've got the enough nutrients showing up at the right time to carry your crop through. And then make observations for crop health, soil life, and soil structure. Okay, let's go to the next one. And here's just some shots of nitrogen deficiency and potassium deficiency. As you're monitoring out in the field, these are the things that hopefully you're not finding. And if you are finding, then it's time to ask, okay, what broke down in the system? Did we miscalculate? Did we put manure on that had a lower analysis than we anticipated? Sometimes we find that happening. So if you look on the left, you've got a corn leaf there, several, and you've got nitrogen deficiency showing in the center rib going to the tip of the leaf. Nitrogen is mobile. It takes it from the bottom of the leaf and it moves it to the top. So if you're seeing that, then you're a pretty good chance that something got mixed up in the system. On the right, we have potassium deficiency. It's very similar, only the opposite, where it's necrotic on the edge of the leaf all the way up to the tip. Now, that's one I'm starting to see more and more of as I go across the country. I think it's higher fertilizer prices. If farmers are starting to cut back, they don't want to cut back on nitrogen. Maybe they're cutting back on potassium. But as a rule, when you start looking at soil testing laboratories in general, when they publish like the trends of soil testing levels, potassium is one that seems to be slipping a little bit. Okay, let's go to the next one. And I'm just showing you, these are slides. Most of these slides are the pictures that I've taken. And this is what I see as I'm going from farm to farm across the season. Let's look at sulfur. Sulfur is another mobile element, so it's going to show up as yellow plant tissue toward the top of the plant. And you'll mostly see this in coarser textured soils and lower organic matter. We'll talk a little bit more about sulfur in a bit. On the right, of course, is a fairly classic example of zinc deficiency in corn. What I see, the most common nutrient deficiency in corn is zinc, as far as copper, iron, manganese, zinc are concerned. Okay, go to the next one. And here's soybeans. We got potassium deficiency on the left. Same theme. It's an edge around the edge of the leaf, a yellowing. And I actually saw quite a bit of the, well, not quite a bit, but some remarkable examples of this here. And irrigated sandy field. And he called me up. He had a situation, somebody I hadn't worked with probably about 10 years. And identified it, verified it with a soil test, put an appropriate blend on. It got reined in, and it sent me a picture in 2 weeks that it just completely turned it around. Don't always happen that fast, but it was good to see in that particular case. But that's exactly what it looked like. On the right, then you have a sulfur deficiency in soybeans. Again, you're going to see this in very light textured soils and low organic matter. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, here we have just a little bit more on nutrient deficiency in alfalfa. On the left is potassium. You see that yellow speckling. Again, the same thing, same theme where you have yellowing on the edge of the field. And this can be fairly common in alfalfa if you're not maintaining those potassium levels, because alfalfa takes such a pretty significant amount of potassium out of the ground. Okay, on the right is probably the most common trace mineral deficiency I see in alfalfa is boron deficiency. Now, this is a non-mobile element, so it's going to show up toward the top of the plant where the plant tissue is developing. And it's going to show up as yellow, and it's kind of a rose color. And that's the tissue that is deficient of it when the plant tissue is growing. And so, and it also feels very leathery. So those are some of the things that you should be looking for and monitoring, you know, in these specific crops. And obviously these aren't everything that, you know, could be gone into, but go ahead into the next slide. but it's good to know that what to look for and how to look for it. I just want to just touch briefly, very briefly on sulfur, because there's more and more concern about, it seems we need more and more sulfur. Why is that? And here's a couple charts of um, this first one here. Just look to the one to the left where it's in the red there. That's like the rust belt. And to go back to 1990, and we're looking at like up to 45 pounds of kilograms per hectare, which is close enough to pounds per acre for our purposes. So 40 pounds per acre of sulfur that we got in through the rain, through what we used to refer to as acid rain. Go to the next one. And this is another study that was done from 2000 to 2020. And this came out of Crops and Soils magazines. And same spot, we're looking at greater than 20. So we went from 40 pounds to 20 pounds per acre sulfur. And if you go and look at where that would be today, we're probably looking at about 6 pounds of sulfur. So, I mean, if you really look at it over the last 30 years, we've got maybe 1/5 the amount of sulfur coming through atmospheric deposition than we did 30 years ago. So sulfur's something, I don't want to paint it as a magic bullet. If you're on heavy soils and you've got high organic matter, you probably are not going to see the sulfur deficiency, but if you're anything else, pay attention to it. Okay, next one. We'll move on. Oh, this is just an example. I don't want to beat this one to death, but this is kind of a fun one. Farmer I worked with applied some potassium sulfate and pelletized gypsum, forgot to turn the spinners on. And for the most part, that swallow that was in the blend, in what you're seeing there was no nitrogen, or that's a sulfur response. Okay, go to the next one. Now let's just talk a little bit about weeds: grasses, broadleaves, annuals, perennials, winter annuals. Go to the next one. We'll just keep moving here so we don't run out of time. When you're really looking at your weed management strategy and you're monitoring for like what's working and what isn't, there's some things about weeds to keep in mind. And one of the first thing I always think about is, this is from NDSU. It's just a short list of early emerging weeds for soil temperatures 35 to 40. And then we have late emerging weeds that are above 50. So basically weeds that are going to grow at the same time small grain is, and weeds that are going to grow the same time that corn and soybeans are going to grow. And so it's really important as you mix up your crop rotation that you disrupt those weed cycles. If you look at, okay, we got well, let's just keep going. We'll run out of time. Thank you. Weeds. Okay. Understand the growth patterns for the type of weeds in your fields. Implement crop rotation to disrupt weed life cycles. Historically, we always used to say, rotate grasses and legumes, warm season and cool seasons. That was just always the old rule of thumb that we always use when we put together crop rotations. And then pay attention to changing weed populations due to cropping and tillage practices. This can be huge because, there's so much change in our tillage practices, moving from conventional tillage to more conservation tillage, no tillage, and things like that. Pay attention to what's happening to the weed patterns, because they will change. I had a situation once, we had this operation I was directly involved in, and what we were trying to do was to minimize tillage, minimize costs. We put together a rotation where we planted barley and peas together, harvested that as grain, planted rye, and then in the spring we no-till soybeans in the rye, and then either we clipped the heads off, or some places we harvested the rye off the top of the soybeans. Then afterwards we went back to barley and peas. We did that over a 3-year cycle, so in other words, of course, 6 years. And what we found was the system started to fall apart because we were only doing 1 or 2, average of 1 tillage practice per year. What we started to see is an increase in Canada thistle, an increase in quackgrass, and an increase in winter annuals, plus the yield of the peas was starting to drop, because ideally with peas and root diseases and things like that, you should be looking more at 4 years rather than 2 years. There was not enough diversity in that operation to make it sustainable. But it was an interesting lesson to learn. Okay, next one. I want to talk about fertilizer and weeds a little bit because what I've always noticed, and of course, this is the stuff that I'm looking as I'm going across the Midwest, mostly Minnesota these days. But over the years, the relationship to fertility and weed pressure. And so I've got one here: low fertility and weed pressure. Weeds scavenge for nutrients better than the crop in low fertility soil. Low fertility soils allow weeds to outcompete and get ahead of the crop. If you look at the picture to the bottom right here, notice that the corn is starving far more for nitrogen than the weeds that are growing underneath it. And so, okay, go to the next one then. Okay, high fertility in weeds, and this is an example of what happens. And again, it's another a fertilizer spreader spinner mishap, and they were putting on about, I don't know, was it 1,200 pounds of chicken manure pellets or something, and the spinners weren't turned on, and so this is what we wound up with. And notice how much more aggressively the yellow mustard, the wild mustard, is growing more than what the oats is. The weeds just have the ability to scavenge for nutrients and capitalize on high nutrients better than the crop. So the perspective I always taken was to fertilize appropriately for the crop and then do the battle that you need to do to keep the weeds in check. Okay, next one. Okay, I'll just review these. Fertilizer programs should be appropriate for the crop being grown. Fertilize for what the crop needs. Excess fertility can cause weeds to grow more aggressively than aggressively than the crops we grow. Weeds can better capitalize on excess nutrients. Under-fertilization can cause crop stress, allowing weeds to outcompete against the crop because of their better ability to scavenge for nutrients. Oftentimes I'll hear, well, I don't like fertilizing because all I'm doing is fertilizing for weeds, and they got you both ways. Okay, continue. We'll talk about a little about insects. See, I got to check my time here if I can slow down or not. I need to be done. Okay, I got 20 minutes. Okay. Insect pests and cropping systems. Some pests can be managed through crop rotations, and some pests occur because of favorable environmental conditions. In other words, some can be carried and remain in the field from one year to the next, and some of them just kind of blow in, like armyworm, cutworm, things of that nature. And so these are things that also need to be monitored. Okay, I think we're done with this one. Okay, and here's just some examples. And again, these are not all examples. This is the stuff that I run into on a regular basis, and particularly what's still burned in my mind from this challenging year we've had this past year. Insects that overwinter in fields and can be managed through crop rotation. Some would argue about alfalfa weevil, but if you just have alfalfa wheat 1 year, you probably won't have alfalfa weevil that much of a problem. Corn rootworm, we can manage that through crop rotation. And soybean cyst nematode, we can manage that as well through crop rotations. Now, other insects that we have to be concerned, insects that infest the crop from outside, stuff that blows in and is different from year to year. Armyworm is one. We don't have that often, but whenever it shows up, we sure wish we didn't. And then we have cutworm. European corn borer, I listed here. It's not much of an issue anymore because the BT corn, which is really a benefit to us as organic producers. But there is more and more talk about resistance to the BT varieties. So we may want to keep an eye on that one as we move forward. Potato leafhopper, that's an insect that tends to blow in with those south storm systems that come out of the Gulf. They kind of filter in and then they go to work. Seed maggot, I want to spend a little time on that one because that one has really caught us off guard a few times. And soybean aphids, well, it's there. It's not a lot to do about it. not very good, effective organic sprays. And the best thing we can look at there is resistant varieties. Okay, go to the next slide. Okay, a little more on alfalfa weevil larvae. What can we do to protect ourselves within our organic rotations? You can take, for this particular pest, it mainly goes after alfalfa. And one thing you can do is diversify your plant species in your hay planting mix. In other words, instead of having straight alfalfa, which is what it typically goes for, if you put clovers in there, if you put grasses, perhaps other forbs, to diversify that hay system, that forage system, then you can minimize the amount of damage. It's a type of crop that will show up right before first crop. It will be a tremendous burden on the regrowth for the second crop. And then about the 4th of July, at least our region up here, the 4th of July, it's pretty much done for the year. So another way that I've seen farmers unintentionally manage this thing is they let their first cutting go really, really late. So the larvae will eat, themselves until they pupate off the first cutting, so that when the second cutting comes along, it's not hampered very much by it. But that isn't necessarily good advice for quality, forage production. One thing that we have found that works effectively on this fairly well is spinosads. Okay, go to the next one. Corn rootworm. Unless you're doing corn on corn on corn, I don't see much of a problem with this. Just be aware that it's there. If you've got leaning stalks, start digging, see what you got going on. And if you're seeing this stuff, maybe it's time to take your certifier's advice and maybe back off on the corn a little bit. But it's just something that you got to keep an eye on. Usually those beetles come out about silking time. So if you're starting to see a lot of beetles in your cornfield at that point that haven't flown in from the neighbors, start getting a shovel out and start digging. If you're seeing that, then you need to reassess the effectiveness of your crop rotation. Okay, next one. Soybean cyst nematode. Again, this is one that has really maybe been flying below the radar for us organic farmers. Never thought we had much of an issue, but I think it's one we should start looking at. Years ago, out of Iowa State, when they were talking about soybean cyst nematode, and they says, well, they're here, and it's not a matter of if, it's just a matter of when. And I think with organic farms, that when is a lot longer than conventional farmers, but I'm starting to see it. And so we may need to start looking for resistant varieties. And what you're looking at here, if you see the guy's thumbnail here, and there's these little white dots, they actually look like lemon-colored balls in the shape of a football, and maybe they're 1/10 the size of a soybean cyst nematode. If you got a stressed plant, dig those roots up and very carefully. If you're starting to see some of those, then that should put you on high alert. Then you can send a soil sample into a laboratory to get counts, and depending what your count range is, that'll tell you whether you can manage it through resistant varieties, or if it's full-blown that high, you may have to significantly expand your soybean rotation. So again, another thing to monitor for and keep on your radar. Okay, next one. Army worm, they're kind of hit and miss, but like I said before, when they show up, they can suddenly become your priority. The thing to keep in mind about this, because there's so much talk about cover crops, and they're really great, but sometimes these cover crops can invite things in. But 2 years ago, an armyworm hit the state. University of Minnesota sent out a bulletin on it, their email lists or whatever, and they said that armyworm is in these counties, and oh, by the way, they came in rye cover crop fields. Because what armyworm are going to do, when the moths come in, they're going to look for grass to lay their eggs on. They'll hatch in 10 days, whatever it is, and they'll start they'll start moving through the area. So if you're doing something like a lot of grass, just be very attentive that you may be attracting insects such as armyworm. If you have these, I've seen farmers do very well with spinosad. Within 5 days, if it's an appropriate application. Of course, it'll probably cost you about $75 an acre for corn and $40 an acre for alfalfa weevil larvae. But at least you have an option. Next slide. Cutworm, and these kind of come and go. Again, if you watch the bulletins that come out, they have traps set up. They'll let you know when they're coming in the area and just start looking. And here's some evidence of some cutworm damage. It can be very devastating or it can be slight. How do you defend against yourself? That would be make sure that you've got a hefty plant population, and using flex varieties helps a lot as well. I just love flex varieties because they can make up for so many mistakes. Cultivator blight to lightning strikes to whatever you want to call them. Okay, the next one. European corn borer. Let's see. Again, that's managed with BT, and I mention it because the concern about resistance. Historically, they're every 5 to 7 year cycles. So anybody that cut their teeth in the 80s and 90s, back at, like I like to say, back in the late 1900s, we dealt with this on a regular basis. And when BT corn came in, it not only became less of a problem for the conventional farmers, but for the organic farmers as well. Okay, next one. There's just some more shots of European corn borer. We can keep going through. Leaf hoppers. Here's another one that kind of flits in coming off of those storms. And I usually see them in alfalfa and edible beans. Don't work much with potatoes. They're probably there as well. They're called potato leaf hopper. But they'll show up, with the storms season that comes in. And not so much in first cutting alfalfa, but maybe as we start getting into second cutting and into early August. And then usually by the second half of August, as the days start getting short, they just kind of disappear. They're not that much of an issue anymore. Never heard anybody explain that. That's just what I see. And they can be quite a problem. They're just something to watch. And if you have to go after them, we've had good luck with just the organic pyrethrums. Okay, the next one. I believe this one is, okay, this is another example of leafhopper burn in alfalfa. This is how bad it can get, where they just toast that alfalfa. What happens is they're sucking, piercing insect. They leave substances in the leaf that are toxic to the plant, and they just wall it off and they start browning up. What I always found interesting is that if you look at that, it looks very similar to a boron deficiency in alfalfa. The only difference is all those little black specks on the leaves. So don't get those two confused. And again, pyrethrum, if it's that bad, has been shown to be effective. But the other thing is, if you have more diverse species in your alfalfa, oftentimes we'll see we got more predators in those environments, and it keeps these things in checks. So that resiliency, bringing more diversity into this farming operation to help buffer you from these extreme insect problems. Okay, next. We have about 10 minutes. And here's a shot of leafhopper burn and edible beans. This can be quite concerning. You can see the leafhopper right dead center in the midrib of that leaf. It's just sitting right there. But that's the kind of damage you'll see, and they'll start cupping. Oftentimes farmers, they'll just roll with it because edible beans are so prolific at producing abundant leaves. They didn't need to be all that concerned about it, but I have seen it so bad that they just turn them brown. They're like little plastic or paper bags. They just crunch. That, of course, would be too far. So, okay, next. Oh, seed maggot. Now this one will come to get you. Seed maggot is not only a problem in corn, but it also is a problem in beans. Seed maggot is one of those that what they're attracted to. Um, well, I got a note here. Avoid planting in seed beds with decomposing organic material at or near the soil surface. And so if you're leaving a lot of residue on the surface, like we're told to do in the soil health practice to keep that soil covered, well, you could easily be attracting these seed maggots. And you find them in corn and you find them in soybeans. That's mostly where I find them. And so if there's a lot of trashy residue on the surface, you can be setting yourself up for these. With soybean, is at least it's a little bit different. If you're finding yourself having to seed in an environment like this, try to wait until the soil is warm, I mean really warm, so that they're out of the ground within 3 to 4 days. The cotyledons, in other words, emerge, because once they're out of the ground, the feeding stops and they'll be fine. But the longer they stay in the ground, the less of the cotyledon is left, the less vigor they'll have, and they may not even make it out of the field. So that's your first line of defense when it comes to that. And also, just be mindful of the residue issue that occurs with these. Okay, next. Soybean aphids, hey, we're all experiencing that. Probably our best defense on this is resistant varieties and natural predators. We used to put out lady beetles for these, but you really can't get those anymore. I think the word got out. But the one thing nice from, let's say, 15 plus years ago when they first hit, at least we have more predators. We have wasps. We have funguses that will come in after those to kind of keep them in check. So at least they're not nearly as devastating in most years like they used to be, where they used to take your yield less than 10 bushels per acre. And now, okay, if you got a bad year, maybe you're going to do 25 or 30, but I'm not going to say it doesn't get worse than that, but it's not as bad as it used to be. Okay, next. Getting down here. Just a few things on plant diseases. The things that I saw that were quite alarming this past year was white mold, even soybeans in places that I never saw it before, just because the conditions were so bad. That's the one thing about that one in a lot of these is that when we have wet, high humidity seasons, we're going to be more prone to these types of things. And so then we get into Fusarium head blight. Well, let's go to the next slide. I got pictures here. Yeah, now we'll talk about white mold. White mold is common in sunflowers, edible beans, peas, soybeans, other crops. I believe hemp is on that list as well. Crop rotation is the main preventative management tool. So in other words, be careful that you don't stack too many white mold crops in your rotation. I had a farmer that I worked with that he had sunflowers, dark red kidney beans, and soybeans in his rotation. And, I pointed out that might be a problem under certain years, and I should have been more assertive because one year the conditions were perfect, lost every crop on the whole farm. So yeah, I've seen that happen. So but the main thing is how are you going to make your operation more resilient to that, and try not to stuff too many white mold crops in your rotation system, or else wide row systems can be helpful. And there are some products that you can help to counter that as well. Yeah, again, crop rotation is the main preventative for this. Okay, let's go to the next one. As I'm winding down here, Fusarium head blight. I've never seen it as bad as this year. It didn't matter if you had resistant varieties. It helped if you planted early. It was just one of those years that Even the conventional guys that were spraying it were having a hard time getting their stuff to be effective with it. But now we know what it is, that's for sure. So what do you do? Resistant varieties, crop rotation, avoid planting after corn and other susceptible crops. In other words, if you have a residue and you have it on the surface and you're coming in with something like winter wheat, and it can we call the green bridge effect. It'll go from last year's residues to this year's crop, and it can also be airborne as well. But if you're putting it into an environment like that and the conditions are right, you're really setting yourself up. Okay, the next one. Tar spot, we talked a little bit about this morning. I'm really happy to hear that they're really gearing up some resistance for this, because this one could be a tough one. And again, it's the same thing. When you talk to the entomologist, or not the entomologist, the crop disease guys, why is all of a sudden this just shows up? First detected in 2015 in Illinois, Indiana, currently found as far north as Stearns County. That's like right out my door. And Morrison County's in central Minnesota. And here's a map showing, the spread of this thing. Now up here, it's not coming early yet, enough yet to cause significant damage, but it is down in southeastern Minnesota. And one of the things that he mentioned was that we're planting corn in more residue than we ever have in the past. And if there's tar spot on the corn residue, it's going to be a direct vector into the upcoming crop. And so we may need to be looking at some residue management on that as well. Okay, I think I have 2 minutes to spare for questions.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Glenn, and everything. I appreciate you being flexible with as well. And give a thanks to Denise for being Glenn's Vanna White.
There you go. Thanks, Denise. I appreciate it. We did good.
We got one question here. Any recommendations on reducing tillage pan?
Reducing tillage pan. Heavy machinery. You may need to be looking at the old practice would have been used deep tillage, or else cover crops, tillage radish, and things of that nature. As we get more into the cover crops, I would anticipate we'll be seeing less issues with that, or that being a better tool. But if the conditions are bad enough, you just got to reach for the tool you thought that's going to be effective.
All right, Glenn. And then one more question here. What do you think, if there's one thing you wish more farmers did on their land and everything, what's that one thing?
That one thing I wish they would do is be able to rely on the crops that they should be planting in their rotations, rather than having the markets dictate what they should be growing. That's what really makes things difficult. And you got to find that balance. And it's not an easy question to ask or answer. Mm-hmm. But, I've come across some farms and everything is just set up. And I'm like, what am I even doing here? Just give them a gold star and move on. The crops are in the rotation is in the right place. The manure is going in the right place. Just clickety-click. Their weed control is good. But if we start chasing markets, it's harder to keep those systems together.
And then just I'm squeezing one quick question here, and everything. What would you consider a good organic crop rotation in the upper Midwest?
If buy yourself a herd of cows and start making hay. That would be ideal. Otherwise, corn, soybeans, with a small grain, underseed with a medium red clover. That's basically our standard rotation that I always like to start row crop farmers with. because that medium red and there could be other things too. That's just the one I typically go to. That's the easiest to manage. And I think Mike was making some comments on that as well.